Hi, everybody. Welcome to Of Source Not. Today, we're going to walk you through some different ways on how to use primary sources from the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. I'm Sara Cardello, the head of education for the Libraries and Archives, and we'll be joined first by Mike Skomba, who is a high school history teacher from New Jersey. He became affiliated with the Libraries and Archives at the Smithsonian as a Neville-Pribram Fellow, which is a program we offer every summer to educators. And then I'll come back and highlight some information literacy skills through the Libraries and Archives digital collections. And then we'll hear from Pam Henson, the institution historian, who's going to walk us through how to use some oral histories. So those are the introductions. And with that, let's get started with Mike.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think it's customary. I don't think you're allowed to start any kind of web conference without saying, all right, I'm going to jump right in. So let's jump right in here. First off, I want to thank Catherine Neville for with her generosity. I was able to do this fellowship in 2019. I did it at the Cooper Hewitt Design Library, where I was incredibly lucky to work underneath Jen Coleman Brocky. She showed me how to be an elite researcher, elite thinker, and we just crushed it together. I also want to thank my students. I'm going to detail a lesson that my students have helped me, to improve every time. We've used it. You're actually going to hear from a couple of my students, Kevin and Alex today. And last but not least, I want to thank my awesome team members, right, Sarah and Pam, for being awesome to work with and just all around good human beings. So if we could jump into the first slide. So my main goal for today is to really establish a framework that you guys can replicate for having difficult conversations, right? Or having conversations about problematic histories. The way I frame it for my students, to be very student-centric and kind of meet them where they are, I use the grandiose question, where does history come from? All right, so it's a question that not a lot of young people generally ask. So it's a historiography lesson. I don't call it that, right? Because students would probably glaze over if you start throwing out terms like historiography. All right, so I try to meet them where they are and ask that big question, where does history come from? So you can see on the next slide, I also start with a Black Eyed Peas quote, the great American philosophers, they said, let's get it started. So we're going to start with a hook or a big inquiry-based question. All right, when you think about the term California dream, what do you picture? So if you guys can do this for me right now at home, if you're one of those people like me who loves to go analog in the summer, jot down a couple of words, right? What do you picture when you hear the term California dream? All right, what comes to mind? So, this is where, I'm gonna have some wait time here, wait time. So try to go a step further, right? So when you might have pictured, 2 or 3 things, try to think 4 or 5 different things that come to mind when you hear that term California dream. So this is a student-friendly question. All right, a little sneak peek. Pam, Sarah, you guys ready to sing with me? So, before we jump into a couple of the exemplars that I picked out, even though this song came out a couple of decades before I was born, before my parents met, when I think about California Dream, it always parks me in a VW bus, right? I go to the 1960s culture, and I don't think there's more emblematic than, the California Dream than the Mamas and the Papas song. So if we could cue that up for the audience and put them in the right mindset, let's roll the video. All right. So California dreaming, right? Like a concept that is loosely based to the historical inquiry we're going to talk about. But in my opinion, it's very symmetrical, right? So it might not be directly aligned, right, to the scholarship we're about to engage in, but it's symmetrical in the sense that you're asking students a big question, right? You're trying to get them to think about categories and different thresholds in the chronological timeline of California. So when you jotted things down, you might, think of First Nations people like thriving in the area we now know as California. You might think about Spanish settlement. You might think about the gold rush, which a lot of people write down. All right, you might be thinking grapes of wrath and Okies making their way to this land of opportunity. You might be thinking about the entertainment industry, right? Or you might be like our kids and write down TikTokers, right? So to me, even though the question's not incredibly 100% aligned to the idea that we're going to talk about in sourcing, it gets students thinking in these bigger frames, right? It gets them thinking in a longer timeline, and gets them thinking in a historical inquiry-based way. So if we can go to the next slide. So again, I'm going to say time and time again, I'm big in meeting students where they are. So in order to establish a method for studying any complicated history, I like to think about, where the students are coming from first. I think that's a luxury I have as someone who might not have been the most engaged when I was a student in high school. So I always want to start from their seat, right, and work their way back. So one concept that I established early on in the year is the idea of scale flipping. So you'll see a slide from the video Powers of 10. I think a lot of us watched when we were growing up. There's a new one with Morgan Freeman. It's good. So it's the idea of thinking across chronological scales, but also spatial scales. So you're going to talk. You're going to hear me use that term, that native vocabulary of scale flipping. So in order to properly source something, you have to be able to flip scales, right? Both time, right, in space, and think about different ways to look at the same problem. And if we can click to the next picture. So I use the lesson from Stanford History Education Group, right, which talks about a lunchroom fight. The past couple of years, especially because we haven't had lunchroom, some students have like raised an eyebrow, like, hey, what do you mean lunchroom fight? So maybe you rephrase it as someone getting caught doing a TikTok dance in the hallway or something. But it's the idea that if something happened in the school, right, if you had 30 people looking at it, right, you're going to have a whole bunch of different perspectives on what happened, right? You're going to have different stories. So again, flipping scales, right, spatially and chronologically, but also flipping perspectives with the lunchroom fight model. You guys can see on the next slide. When I was doing my fellowship, I was lucky enough, again, to work under Jen Coleman Brocky, and she introduced me to really the largest collection of World's Fair materials. Right, and I gravitated towards the 1893 Book of the Fair. It's infamous, right? The 1893 Columbia Exposition. I thought it was going to be a great jumping off point for a lesson on the Industrial Revolution or a lesson on the end of the 19th century. But as we dove deeper, right, I found new perspectives on the author that I didn't really expect, and it was really like my own inquiry-based lesson, right? It was my own inquiry-based learning experience. So we can click on the next photo. The preface, a bunch of interesting imagery, right, that caused me to raise my first eyebrow. We click on it again to zoom in. One more click. Yep. So this is the cardinal sin of PowerPoint presentations, right? I'm throwing a ton of text at you, right? But you guys are adult learners, right? I think that you guys can skim, right? You guys are educators, right? You're masters at the art of skimming a lot of text. So when I first read this, right, my first go through, it fit, the brand, right? it was a book written about the Columbian Exposition, which was really like a celebration of the Industrial Revolution, right? And, you know, you have to think about when I was doing my own sourcing activity, right, as a educator of a decade, you know, I said, all right, this is on brand, right? This is written and algorithmically designed for, you know, to sell more copies of this book. And you guys can do a deeper dive on your own, right? This can be found on the Smithsonian Library website. There's a copy of this. You know, but as I continue to study, right, and want to know more about the author, some of these words meant different things to me, right? So once I had more context, right, and I started, you know, being critical of the source, a critical consumer of these volumes of the Book of the Fair, right, things, you know, popped out. And when I teach this lesson, I always start with this preface, right? Then I have the students actually go back there and reread it after we do this deep dive on the author. So as I've continued to talk during this time period, you probably haven't heard anything I've said, but read this preface, and some things might, you know, pop out in between the romantic language, right? You know, there's terms like progress of civilization, deliverances from the despotism of nature, social structure, happiness and unity of mind, right? And those things are head scratchers, right? Unity of whose mind, right? Unity of mind does not really account for differences in thinking, right? Heck, it doesn't account for diversity at all, right? Or the idea of social structure, right? Those terms are going to mean a little bit more to you as we go through this. But then there's ideas like elevate and ennoble men, right? And there's some things that sound really good. So, you know, to be intentional about creating this methodology, you know, I'll let students read this as a skim. You know, kind of the second read, I'll put a lot of these terms up on the board, or I'll highlight them in our discussion, like a word wall, or some older students will do, you know, a discussion. We're going to go to the next slide, please. All right, later on, right, you'll see, you know, this is another page in the preface. You dive into, you know, having an influence on social structure, right? Organization of humanity, right? Intellectual supremacy, civilizing influences of the age, right? You know, those words read like a line right out of Rudyard Kipling's, you know, White Man's Burden, right? It's stripping of this imperialistic language. And if we could go to the next photo. Yeah, and there's, you know, again, more, you know, interesting imagery, you know, a sort of exoticism of, you know, different cultures around the world, right? But again, it raises these great questions about, you know, meaning behind these terms, right? They mean one thing as if you're reading it and not being a critical consumer of information and kind of wholesale accepting the language, but it means even more when you go into a deeper understanding of it. You know, and we could definitely focus on these problematic terms, right? And you know, there's a little bit, you know, to borrow a phrase from Sam Weinberg's last book, there's a little bit of a Holden Caulfield in all of us, you know, and teenagers are not short on angst, right? So you can really like tease out, you know, these problematic phrases and have this sort of monolithic narrative of, you know, this is not a trusted author, right? We should not read this. But there's other phrases, right? Like, you know, talking about the evils of isolation, right? Come together. They use the term human family, right? They actually talk about destroying prejudice, right? And the idea that everyone can learn from each other. So I think, you know, to go back to the lunchroom fight, you know, it's very important to not only flip through scales, right? Like the powers of 10 in terms of chronological and spatial, but it's also important to flip through perspectives, right? And see both sides of an argument. You know, if the powers of 10 was, you know, to borrow and kind of paraphrase and edit, you know, Fernand Braudel talked about how you had to be a parachutist and a truffle hunter. You had to zoom in and zoom out. I tell my kids they have to be a skydiver and a scuba diver, right? Be able to see the the big picture, then go beneath the surface. And really for this part of it, right, the lunchroom fight part of it, you have to be able to flip through horizontal perspectives, right, to see both sides of the argument. And really the more perspectives you give your students on an event, the more that monolithic narrative becomes stereoscopic vision of an event. So my hope is not to make you an expert on the Book of the Fair or its author, H.H. Bancroft. My main objective for you guys today is to hopefully create a framework that you guys can replicate in your own classroom. This is a practitioner's guide, right, to studying complicated or problematic histories. So as a history teacher in New Jersey, I stumbled upon this narrative. I'm not teaching in California, right? I'm not teaching on the West Coast, right? There might be different perspectives based on local history or local social constructs. But for me, this was like a perfect case study in teaching my students how to, test a source, right? How to be critical consumers of information. All right, so on the next slide, we're going to start, weighing out the perspective. All right, so this is H.H. Bancroft. I'm widely jealous of his facial hair. I wish I could pull it off. Again, I commit another cardinal sin of putting a whole bunch of text on a slide, but my hope is that if you have access to this later on, or you can go back to this and this could help you with your own preparation. But he's basically he's accredited as being like the first historian of the West. Right, his West started from Alaska, went to the Rockies, and all the way down to Central America, and he collected materials from all over the globe. Right, he dedicated his life to writing a 39-volume history of the West called The Works. So 39 volumes. Right, spent his whole professional career putting this together. And when it was all said and done, he donated 60 source materials to Cal Berkeley, and he's still the namesake of the Cal Berkeley Library. All right, so a lot of times students do get in this mindset of we should write this person off, right? We should move on. But the idea is that history is like a kaleidoscope, right? There's a lot of distortions in history, and if you understand that there are distortions there, right, you can see the clear parts, right? You can see through the kaleidoscope and understand what you're looking at. So I asked the students sometimes, this came up in one of our discussions, how many people are willing to dedicate their entire life to writing a history, right? Or, how many people want to start a library, right? So again, to avoid deficit thinking, I always like to start with problematic history. What good can we find, right? To be overly simplistic. All right, and on the next slide, we're going to get into some of the problematic things. Upon studying H.H. Bancroft, it's widely acknowledged that he used the German note-taking method, right, to source all of these things, right, to get all of these histories transcribed and written and organized into 39 works. Right, and one of his main ghostwriters, to use a student-friendly term, right, was Frances Fuller Victor. Right, after his death, it was widely understood that she wrote an entire history of Oregon. All right, but within his works, there's at least 4 volumes that he wrote by his own hand, and I'm not going to read it out loud, but you can see that he is very critical and diminishing of female writers. Right, so we talked about all the good things he did. Now we're talking about his problematic views on gender. And this is 2-part as well, right? Because the students often ask, like, he did not write this, right? He did not write it by his own hand. This is students are in a culture. Students are in a culture where they get in trouble if they copy a Google Doc. Right, they're in a culture where like plagiarism is a big deal, right? And then his problematic views on gender, right? So it's kind of a two-sided issue. All right, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so problematic views on race. He subscribed to a idea called the German germ theory, right? Which was basically, to paraphrase, it was an idea that, democracy stemmed from the Teutonic force of Germany, basically made its way across Europe to the Americas. Unfortunately, it placed a hierarchy on race, right? So it had this eugenicist tilt, right? So he writes about that. The citation is there. So we scale flip to 1958. So most of these histories were written pre-Civil War and right after the Civil War. So to look at a 20th century understanding of his theory or his perspective on the German germ theory, they actually pull from one of the 39 works that he wrote by himself. If we can click, it should bring up Dr. Risa Aronella's book. Unfortunately, he also valorizes, extrajudicious, lynch mobs that killed non-European Californians, right? So to borrow, to paraphrase the Dr. Aronello, is the idea that he wanted a Boston Tea Party in the West, right? So he valorized these popular tribunals, right, which carried out executions above the law. So it got very complicated with ideas on gender and ideas of taking credit for work that was not his. And it got even more complicated, right, when we start unpacking his views on race. All right, but you can't stop there, right? History happens in these messy edges. So I tell my students that, we have to push through this, right, and push forward, right, to unpack this and, find their conclusions, because it matters. It's not something that we have to come to a consensus on, but it's something that you have to reconcile within yourself, right? The idea with, inquiry-based model is that they're not only finding their own understandings past, your discussions, but they're even, better yet, finding additional questions. So if we can go to the last slide. So this is the student concluding question. There's actually a link to the blog post I wrote on Unbound if you guys want to study this further and you're interested in this topic. These are my two students, Kevin and Alex. So if you see them walk into your school building, selfishly, I would say don't try to help them get a job. They're aspiring teachers. They graduated high school this year. Selfishly, I would not want you to get them a job because I want them to be my colleagues. But both great people. They did an awesome job. This was not coached, right? We did this, I think, December, January, this lesson. And in June, with 3 days notice, I was like, hey, can you record a video on your concluding question? And, they fired it off. So if we can hear from Kevin first, that'd be great.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Acuna and I'm a student at Somerville High School. Today we're going to be talking about Bancroft's history and how he was a racist, sexist, and plagiarized, but also created the most comprehensive history of the American West. So one thing about Bancroft was that he was deeply flawed, but by identifying those things, we can claim test that the rest of his works were incredibly impressive in a scale. I think it's safe to say that Bancroft wouldn't fit in today's society because of his beliefs, but aside from his beliefs, he was a man of his craft. Rest assured, we aren't letting him off the hook, but instead we are seeing him for what he was, which was a complicated and complexly flawed narrator. Again, what we want to keep in mind is that he was a great historian for his time. With that, he was a racist and misogynistic human being, something that no other man had ever created. He genuinely was an influencer of his time, and I think there were people that looked up to him and saw him as this big influence. So if we put all his characteristics aside, I think you could find pretty good things about him as a man of his work and what he accomplished over his life. If you recognize and identify the distortions, you can see the clear points in the kaleidoscope.
So yeah, Kevin did a great job, aspiring history teacher. And to tease out a couple of things, you can see the alignment of vocabulary. A lot of the main ideas that we discussed, he pulled in, right, in his response, right? So there's this common language. And Alex is going to say something similar, right, about the idea of he was flawed, but there's salvageable parts of his history. So we can hear from Alex.
I believe Bancroft, being who he was, just outlines how important it is to claim test everything you read. Not just his work, but all history books. I didn't know where history came from. Prior to this lesson, I just read the textbooks, and you would claim test a little bit, but I think this really opened my eyes to claim testing and how important it is. I believe the facts of Bancroft's history are salvageable. I think the parts that aren't salvageable are the parts that have any sort of rhetoric in them that aren't just straight facts, because those, even if he wasn't trying to have a bias, they're going to have a bias unconsciously just based on who he was as a person, his ideals. But yeah, I think the facts of his history can be trusted fully.
All right, so you can hear Alex, again, weighing, the credibility of the source. They both did an awesome job, and they're going to be great teachers one day. So that was my guiding question I came back to. Hopefully you have affirmed certain parts of your practice when studying complicated histories, or, hopefully I helped you build out like a better model that you can use for your students. All right, because there's millions of history teachers across the country. If we keep pushing, we can make independent thinkers, right, and improve the lives of our students. Now to the main act, Pam.
Thanks, Mike and Kevin and Alex and the mamas and the papas. Before Pam shares with her work on oral histories, I want to highlight some of the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives information literacy collections on Learning Lab. So we've built 18 collections sharing concepts within information literacy like author perspective and bias and source, all highlighted in Mike's work. And these collections can be used by educators or students. And while they are great, they are incomplete. We need you. We need your feedback. So if you're interested in partnering with the Smithsonian Institution and donating maybe 20, 30 minutes of your time to look through a topic and share your thoughts, we greatly appreciate it. And we cite our sources, so you would be named as a contributor in digital print in our collections. So without further ado, let me share this short video on how to find our information literacy resources and explore what we've created. Head on to the video.
Welcome to the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives profile page on Learning Lab, the Smithsonian's digital educational platform. Here we have a number of curated collections of content for users to explore: information literacy, Finding Women in America, From This to That, and so on. But let's just focus on information literacy today. We have 17 collections and still growing. First off here, we have one based on information literacy basics. If we go ahead and open up the collection, here we help the user identify, find, and evaluate and use information effectively. And then if you just scroll down, you can explore our concept of information literacy basics. So here we have an introduction talking about before learning about topics like experts and plagiarism and diffusing knowledge, you really need to understand the basics of information literacy. The search for quality information is more difficult now than ever before. These collections help you figure out who you can trust and where to look for the best information. So what exactly is information literacy? We've got aspects here where you can add open-ended questions. So you could either use this with a class or you can assign it to a student to walk through and make sure that they're really understanding what we're trying to express in these collections. Questions you should be asking as an information detective, looking at a source. Who is presenting this information and why? Who benefits from it? Where was the information from? Was it a credible source? How does the author portray this information with their own bias? Can you tell if the author has written it in a way that is looking to support a specific opinion? Is the source presenting a clear presentation of all the necessary facts? And was any critical information not included? And if so, why not? Every collection we have has a final thoughts panel that's going to give you a space to continue thinking about this topic and what you could do next. Thanks for checking it out.
My amazing intern, Bindi, created that collection. Shout out to Bindi if she's here today, and many more on that site. Please check them out, and I'll talk to you more at the end of this, how you can participate in helping us vet these collections if you're interested. And now, on to Pam.
Hi there. If you go to the first slide. So I am Pam Henson. I am the historian for the history of the Smithsonian. And one of the things I do in my job is oral history interviews of our staff. We have a very diverse staff with all sorts of crazy backgrounds and jobs that they do. And many people work at the Smithsonian for a very long time. The first person we interviewed had worked here for literally 78 years at that point. So it's a great place to do oral history. And so if we can go to the next slide. I want to pick up on what Mike was talking about, which is scale flipping, how we talk about individual stories and big stories, because the question I want you to think about is, how do historians balance the big stories of global events like World War II, the COVID pandemic, and the smaller stories of the way individuals experience their life? So what we're going to do today is explore some oral histories and see what that can tell us about how to balance out these two stories. So next slide. Okay. Oral history, I've used that term. What is it? Well, it is recording and preserving the memories of people's lives. So their unique stories and their unique experiences. And we not only listen to people's stories, but we record them and we preserve them so other people can look at them down the road. And it really gives us their unique perspective on what happened to them in the past. So next slide. And so we're going to look at today veterans in the post-World War II U.S. And often World War II veterans have been called the greatest generation. The 1950s is portrayed as an absolutely idyllic time when veterans went to school on the GI Bill and got great jobs in a booming economy. This was true of my own father. I grew up in New Jersey, and he volunteered to enter the war, and he was placed in the Army Corps of Engineers. And he served in Europe and the push into Germany. And he did make it through the war. And when he left, he went to college on the GI Bill and got an engineering degree and became a construction engineer building skyscrapers in New York City. So he lived this kind of 1950s post-war dream that we talk about. But was this true for all American veterans? Probably not. So how do we find out a little bit more about the varied experiences of veterans? And can an individual's oral history of the war and their post-war years disagree with that picture that we would see on television? So next slide. So one of the people that we've interviewed, a staff member, is Lou Purnell. He lived from 1920 to 2001. And he was in college when World War II broke out. He left college and volunteered with Tuskegee Airmen, where he was trained as a fighter pilot for World War II and sent to Italy. Lou Purnell loved to fly, and he loved airplanes. And they occupied a very large portion of the rest of his life. So now we're going to go to a little sound clip where he talks about his favorite plane that he flew in Italy in World War II.
But I heard, well, when did you get the P-51 Mustangs?
We got them when we moved to Ramatulli, and we were under the 15th Air Force, which is strategic.
So what did you think about those planes?
The P-51 was the greatest plane that was ever put out by the ever owned by the U.S. Air Force. Good visibility, smooth running engine, swift, good response on controls. Oh, everything about that thing was just fine. The flying characteristics were so much better than any of the previous planes that we had flown. It was a pilot's dream.
So post-World War II, he, like my father, went to college. He finished college, but unlike my father, he really could not find a decent job. And for 15 years, he did this, he did that. He moved to Washington to see if he could get a better job there. He delivered books at the Library of Congress, and he applied to be a security officer at the Smithsonian. But they said no, they weren't interested in him. He was too educated. And so they did have a position as a museum aide in the paleontology department, which he took. And that was in 1961. He joined the staff of the Smithsonian at a fairly entry-level position. So this is 15 years after he graduated and the war ended. So he goes into the paleontology, invertebrate paleontology at the Natural History Museum, and he has really immediate success. He reads up everything he can learn about paleontology, and this is very typical of Lou Purnell. And you can see all the, just a couple of his medals that he won during the war that he donated to the museum. But he went at paleontology full force. And fairly soon, he was actually publishing books in paleontology. And he was encouraged by his department chair, who was so impressed with him, although his immediate supervisor really gave him a very hard time. But he really was interested in the history of aeronautics, and that was his big dream. And finally, in 1968, when they're building the big new Air and Space Museum, he's able to transfer over there as a museum technician. So next slide. And unfortunately, when he is moves to the next slide, please. When he moves to air and space, does not become curator in space history, in aviation history, I mean, because the aeronautics department did not, quite frankly, want an African-American employee. They would not hire him. But the space history people said, come on over, we'd love to have you. And so he, like he did with everything else, he plunged himself in to learning about the history of the relatively new space race, which had really just begun in 1957 when Sputnik was launched. And he really dove right into building a collection. Space was so new. And so if we could play the little clip of him talking about how he started to build that collection.
Well, as I said, I hit the ground running, made contacts with NASA. I think it was then that we drew up this NASA-Smithsonian agreement whereby everything that was manufactured for the astronautics program, once it served its purpose, it was offered to the Smithsonian as first choosers. And to see the things that were offered to us, it was just so exciting, and I wanted to get my hands on this so much in a short time. And then the paperwork, to know how to nail these things down, to talk to NASA. Not only did we get it through NASA, a lot of the artifacts, but we went directly to the companies that manufactured them. And it was my duty to visit them and select and choose. McDonnell Douglas, North American Rockwell, Grumman were all manufacturing things for the space program. And just to walk in there and see the things that you like in the collection was like putting a kid in a candy store.
And he really was, and he really thrived at the Air and Space Museum. And he was advanced, of course, to curator there until he retired in 1985. So next slide, please. But he was, nope, one back. Here we go. So he did get the opportunity to work on an exhibit on aviation, which was wonderful. There was staff changeover, things were much more open. And in 1982, he produced the exhibit Black Wings, the American Black in Aviation. And this was actually on exhibit in the museum from 1982 to 2016 as one of the major exhibits in the museum. So it was on display for 34 years and really just closed down as they got ready to close the building for renovations. And the website is still available online. And it does have an African-American Pioneers in Aviation teacher guide, a PDF that you can download and use in your classroom to teach about the first Blacks that were pioneers. And this was really in the 1920s, 10s and 20s, and the generation prior to the Tuskegee Airmen. The Air and Space Museum allowed him ultimately to reach his dream, to curate an exhibit like this, to be a curator, to build the space history collection, because he was an extraordinary human being. But it took him far longer than it did for people from other backgrounds. And so he did manage to do it. So it's a complicated story. He did manage to get there, but it took a lot of initiative on his part to get him there. Now, was this only the African-American community? What about other groups? So let's go to the next slide. And so there are a whole bunch of groups that at the end of the war, there really wasn't much being said about them. One of the interesting ones are the Navajo code talkers. The Marines started using Navajos because they spoke this language that was not very well known anywhere outside of the Navajo community. And they could use that language to communicate information that no one else was going to know what these two people were saying to one another. So the Navajo code talkers, ultimately, there were quite a number of them throughout the military by the end of World War II, and their code was never broken. So this was a really solid way to convey information at battle scenes and things like that quite safely. But after the war, at least for a while, they were completely forgotten. Fortunately, the Marine Corps had an oral history project, and one of the first things was the historian there started interviewing them and then kind of promoting these interviews a little bit. Now they're fairly well known, and they have recorded their own interviews, and you can find things on the web about them. During World War II, a lot of women wanted to make contributions as well. And they became WACs in the Army and WAVES in the Navy. And they assisted military on all fronts, from care of the wounded, clerical work, which we think of, but they also drove vehicles, ambulances up to the front line. They flew planes in combat areas to deliver the planes. They were trained in the repair of cars, tanks, and airplanes. And so they did a wide variety of things that they found very exciting and really saw another whole world during the war. But at the end of World War II, it really was not discussed, and they were encouraged. I mean, the literature on this, the advertising, everything was for them to go back to the kitchen and be the wife and let the men have the jobs. So it took a while till we started to hear their stories as well. And another group were the Nisei. These are second generation Japanese Americans. As I think a lot of us know now, during the war, Japanese American citizens, and they were U.S. citizens, were vilified and placed in concentration camps. And surprisingly, many of the young men put in those camps actually volunteered for the U.S. Army and had some of the really most highly decorated units in the war. But when the war ended, they got out, but all of their property had been seized, their education had been disrupted, their businesses had been taken over, confiscated during the war. So they really had a very difficult time just trying to get back on their feet again. and have a home and have a decent income. At some point, in fact, they started doing oral histories about this, and now we know a great deal more about these people. And when you put all of these various stories together, you get a much more complicated story, but a much richer story of what the greatest generation consisted of, because these were all contributors to the greatest generation. So next slide. And ways you can work on students with this is many of these interviews are available online, and these groups have websites. So I created a handout for you, and you'll see a lot of the addresses there. It's at the end of this presentation. But have your students search for and find interviews online. And just they could write a report, they could use them as background. But they can also create a podcast, which students really like to do these days, and they can weave together some of these stories, and they can be very compelling. There are really wonderful ones. They can prepare an exhibit. There are a lot of images on these websites also, or they could do it as a National History Day project. It's a great topic for a National History Day project. Or they could, for example, stage a play, do a dramatic presentation on these various contributors to the war and what they did. Now, how would they go about finding them? Next slide, please. So they can look the Veterans Oral History Project at the Library of Congress, and that will be on your handout. Not only has lots of interviews that people have sent in, their reminiscences, but what they also have are a page where they list lots of other projects where you can find things. The National World War II Museum, which is in New Orleans, has a great website with oral histories on it. You can search for various military units, and they often have a web page of their own. And the various services, history offices have oral histories. And they can search for topics such as Densho, which is the Japanese American site, Code Talkers, or Tuskegee Airmen. And you will find wonderful websites with lots of resources there. So next slide. So the stories of World War II veterans after the war are very complicated, not the simple post-war Leave It to Beaver or movie stories. It wasn't just that we forgot to tell them the story of them during the war, but their story after the war was very different than the way the post-World War II America has been described. They had their oral histories enriched our history of World War II, but more importantly, the decades after it. And they've shown this incredible dedication to the United States, and they are a source of tremendous inspiration, I think, to students who work with these. So I would encourage you to see if you can do some projects with these, because they're readily available online now. And I'll turn it back over to Sara now.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. If we can go to the next slide, we've got a couple of links just to share out with you to highlight places that you can find us and some of the resources. There we go. So just the Smithsonian site in general, the Smithsonian Learning Lab site, which is where you were seeing my information literacy collections. On the handout that Pam was referencing is the more specific link to the information literacy collections that I have. The Libraries and Archives for Educators page is on there as well. And again, if you would like to collaborate with us on our information literacy project and be cited as a collaborator in helping us get these collections ready for the classroom, please send me a note at my email. It's that very last link there. It's cardellos@si.edu. We would love to hear from you. And if you have any questions for Pam and Mike, you can also send them there. And I'm happy to spread the love and send it along. It was a pleasure being able to share all of these things with you. And Mike, Pam, any final words?
Hope everyone has a great summer and an awesome school year.
What a good teacher.
Yeah. Thank
All
you.
right, thanks, guys.